This is Duke University.
First of all, I want to say how wonderful it is to be in Carolina. I've never been here before. Thank you so much for asking me, for looking after me so well. It really is true what they say. Nothing can be finer. And I want to be obedient. We were told to provide our papers, so I wrote a paper 2 weeks ago, and I put it up. You can read it on my ghastly website if you want to. So it's all there. It's the proof. I've done my job, and we were told to speak for 15 minutes, but not to give the paper because we'd already done the paper. So I'm going to say some things about where, as we say, the paper is coming from, or maybe where it's going to. And I'll start by just saying something about Peterhouse. Peterhouse is a very nice, very small college, the oldest college in Cambridge. I haven't been in Cambridge very long, just a couple of years, so it's all really rather anthropologically strange. Peterhouse is a bit like Hogwarts Academy, very dark, and there's lots of and people do tend to do this thing that they classically say happens in Oxford and Cambridge colleges, that you're sitting with people who are not in your field. And indeed, this is the question they ask you all the time. They turn to you with a mouthful of swan or griffin or something and will say, "So what's your field?" And I find this a very paralyzing kind of question. And so I generally just say something like 19th or 20th century literature, but it's my day off. I have had quite a few days off. And in fact, I used to run a program mentioned already, the London Consortium, that was intended to be a cross-disciplinary or an interdisciplinary program. And students would sometimes sort of come and say, well, tell us how to be interdisciplinary, O master. And actually I came to the view that actually the way to be interdisciplinary is not to do that fancy adjustment of the lenses, like when you're in the optician and they put extra lenses in front of you. Sometimes we think of being interdisciplinary being like that. If I can only get the right combination of lenses, a bit of history, a bit of philosophy to sharpen up the logic, I'll get a fix on this object, as though it were obvious what it was that was there to be fixed on or looked at. But actually, it seems to me the most interesting kind of cross-disciplinary work comes as a result of getting interested in some object that ordinary disciplines, or the disciplines as they're constituted, are not very good at making sense of. And so, if you take something like sport, I'm not a sports historian. There are such things in the world. There are sports historians and sports philosophers. And I'm not a philosopher either, but I am interested in sport. So there was a way of doing that thing, of just being interested in this phenomenon and saying, well, what kind of thing is this, and what might help you to understand it? So it's a kind of object-centered interdisciplinarity that I'm interested in. That's not really what I wanted to say. I wanted to talk a little bit about the much larger picture and the much larger future that I think sport belongs to and can tell us about. Only a few minutes to go. And to do this, I want to borrow the work of a German philosopher. He's got a Dutch name, but he's a German philosopher, Peter Slaughterdyke. He's rather an explosive character, hugely prolific. Not a large number of his works have been translated from German. He's a kind of German Slavoj Žižek, only with rather different politics, but with something of the same sensibility. And the same torrential rate of production. Anyway, in a trilogy of books called Spheres, a kind of philosophical history of bubbles and circles and enclosed spaces, Slaughterdyke proposes that we can understand the thing that we call modernity by means of a single principle, which he calls explizieren, explication might do, but something like explicitation might be a better translation. Making things explicit. It's really a story about human history. What humans do historically is increasingly take things that are background phenomena, that are merely implicit, and move them into the foreground. Most recently, that's included ourselves, our biological beings. That was always just something that, curiously enough, although it was us, it happened to us. Just happened to us. Now we move it into the foreground by means of explicitation. And if you want to know what kind of creature we've become and are universally becoming, then I think that Slaughterdyke's principle will tell us that we're all becoming engineers. A much disregarded branch of academic life, certainly in Britain. I don't know if it's the same here, but most people tend to look down on engineers because engineers just kind of, muck around and do stuff, unlike the physicists who are doing who are finding out the primary things that are true. Engineers are just trying to kind of make stuff work. But making stuff work is pretty much what we're all of us engaged on more and more in more and more areas, in technologies of all kinds, in our buildings, in our genetics, in our economics, trying to make economics work, in our forms of publicity, certainly in our relation to our own bodies, more and more. This is the primary area, perhaps, in which the implicit, the merely given, is being turned into something formed or styled or fashioned, engineered through medicine, surgery, through dance, through sport, through fashion. It seems to me, I have to confess, get terribly excited by the word humanities and by fear of or excitement about the fate of the humanities. I think it is a cultural thing. It's because of the universal polite indifference to religion that reigns in our area, the British area of Protestantism, which is just a kind of excuse for not really having any interest at all in religion. And I think combined with the fact that in Britain the word humanities doesn't have anything to do with the word humanism. We don't have the word humanist. If you're in the humanities, you're just in the humanities. There isn't a word for someone who does humanities. So it's not, in a certain way, a kind of identity, and it's not, in some sense, if humanism is bound up with a refusal of the transcendent or the divine, it somehow doesn't have that charge. Anyway, humanities doesn't have much of a charge for me, and in fact, it seems to me that the big picture is that we in the humanities are just part of this move to universal engineering, to the universal development of techniques. And as it happens, Slaughterdyke has an argument about this. He's got an argument about everything, but he's got an argument in particular about this, with which he begins his book, translated this one into English, You Must Change Your Life. It's a quotation from a Rilke poem. And he begins the book saying that we shouldn't worry about religion and the clash of civilizations or any of this stuff, because religion has never in fact existed. Religions are just a kind of transcendent covering for what he calls the human impulse to eschatology, by which he means the workings of technique, the stylings through various forms of training or ritualized existence, perhaps, of our lives, the creation from a merely given nature to a sort of made nature, second nature. Slaughterdyke's view is that increasingly this is manifesting itself in a form of, or many, many forms, of what he calls immunification. These words always sound much uglier when you translate them out of German into English for some reason. Immunification, he speaks of homo immunologicus. Actually, events like this give us a really good examples, give some really good examples of immune procedures and their relation to techniques. When you give a talk like this, there are various kinds of techniques that are ways of getting the job done, and in a certain sense, insofar as they're repeatable techniques, they're ways of protecting yourself against accident. On the other hand, many of the ways in which you can protect yourself against accident, like by having a PowerPoint presentation, for example, can also expose you to accidents, as we've seen today, as we always do in every academic circumstance like this. You see that there's actually a risk that goes along with the security that a technique gives you. That's the nature of human techniques. That's the nature of human engineering. We engineer the world in such a way as to protect ourselves against threats. Fundamentally, the threat of suffering and of death. Michel Serres, in a footnote to an essay, which in a sense might have generated the whole of this argument. The essay is called The Origin of Language. Michel Serres suggests that because we are poikilotherms rather than homeotherms, that is to say, we have to maintain our body temperatures at a particular level, unlike lizards that can get warm when they sit in the sun and then cool down when they're not in the sun, but we have huge energy demands. This generates the need for shelter and for clothing. A very large part of human culture comes from this fact. If we want to live in all these places that we apparently want to live in, you know, from South Africa to Alaska, we've got to have a lot of technique. We've got to surround ourselves with lots of immune structures, immunological structures. In fact, Michel Serres suggests that perhaps communication is one of these. Human communication is a bit like clothing and shelter. Perhaps, he says, all of our communications, rituals and practices can be reduced to the utterance, keep me warm. So immunitarian structures are what are taking over the world, creating, in a certain sense, a whole second world. Since one of the things that we're trying to immunize ourselves against now, and we desperately need to do this, is precisely the revenge that the world might take upon us for the way in which we have expanded ourselves to world size. One of the great areas of the implicit has always been the weather. It's snowing, it's raining. Who is that entity? What is that entity? What is the it that is raining and snowing? Well, in a certain sense, we're beginning to suspect that it might be in part us. Surely we can't be responsible for the weather. Well, maybe we are, and maybe there's a way in which we have to engineer that too, or engineer ourselves in relation to that, in such a way that we can, so to speak, build an immunity in the world, which is somehow the whole of human civilization, from the world. Michel Serres has called it a world war. A war against the world, a war to protect ourselves from the world and from the world that we have ourselves built. What's sport got to do with this? Well, for Slaughterdyke, sport is the very image of technique, of training, of the practice of forming yourself in some new and wholly gratuitously new way. That in a certain sense forms this, is right at the core of these immunological practices. All the important words in my life, like interdisciplinary and immunological, I can't actually say. So I should, this sounds wonderful, but if you take the example of pregnancy, you have a very good example of how it is that immunological devices actually always have risks. It's not a straightforward thing. You know, it seems to me that pregnancy is safer now in most advanced countries with advanced medical care than at any time in human history. And I can't imagine a time in which it's ever been more miserable because of all the anxiety to which you're exposed by the things that keep you safe. All of the scans you have to have. You don't have to have them, but then you've got consciously to take the choice not to have the scan, and then you might not know about the thing you need to know. You know, huge anxiety always comes. There's huge vulnerability that always comes with the increase in security. What does sport fundamentally do? Well, the thing that has worried many people, and certainly those who are worried by the apparently totalitarian nature of sport that seems to be everywhere, the grandiose nature of sport, which rapidly expands itself onto a kind of world scale, the World Series we like to laugh at outside the US. But actually, we can't really laugh because, you know, it's England who invented and codified at least many sports in the 19th century, who has the appetite for matches between England and the rest of the world. We used to play these matches at my school. There would be an English side, and then there would be others who had to represent the rest of the world. But there is something worldly in that grandiose sense about sport itself, precisely because it is a kind of, all sport in a sense aims to image the whole of everything. It aims to be a kind of substitute or secondary reality, a kind of second nature. And what does it mean to contemplate a world in which we more and more are given over to play? In which more and more and more of our industry, of our economic effort, is based around the act of play, whether in sport or in other forms of playful self-fabrication, in gaming generally, which is overtaking filmmaking, but the entertainment industries more generally. Is this an appalling thing? Well, I think it isn't. I think if you can call it this, the ludication of the world, which has its grotesque and rather terrifying and at times extremely boring aspects, is a way of holding at bay, this is not a new argument, this is a very old argument, is a way of holding at bay the most dangerous thing of all for human beings, which is violence. And the way in which sport holds violence at bay is precisely by embodying it and spreading it out. And that's the way you deal with allergies, peanut allergies, it turns out, through recent work. You get that peanut butter down your young children as early as you can, and you've got a good chance of preventing peanut allergy. We know about immunological response. We've only known for about 120, 130 years. The science of immune systems is a late 19th century science, but it's one that I think expands onto a world scale in really interesting ways. And that's our future, and that I think is a future in which we in the humanities, as part of building up this kind of immunological self-fashioning, that's something that we too are involved in. Thanks.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.